Welcome back to Transcriber from Reddit. Today's topic contains mentions of suicide and attempted suicide and euthanasia, or what some people refer to as assisted suicide. I will be reading this article, then reading an article from an evangelical source on this, and then ending with a brief look at a subreddit post that has more links and more information. This is a serious case, and I want to credit the victim of the rape here, Noelia Castillo Ramos, for her bravery and decision, and I hope that she finds peace in death. The title of this article reads, Gang Rape Victim 25 to Die by Euthanasia in Spain After Jumping Off Roof in Suicide Bid That Left Her Paralyzed. Published March 26, 2026. Below that, we see an image of the now deceased Noelia, and the caption for the image reads, Noelia Castillo Ramos is due to die by euthanasia after a long legal fight. By Asher McShane. I begin reading. A Spanish woman who was gang raped and tried to take her own life is due to die by euthanasia today. Noelia Castillo Ramos, 25, from Barcelona, tried to take her own life by jumping off a roof, but was left paraplegic. She will die later today after a Spanish court overruled her father's efforts to have the procedure halted following a legal battle that lasted over a year. She was in a state-supervised center for vulnerable youth in 2022 when she was gang raped by 3 men. The trauma led her to try and take her own life. However, she survived, but was left paralyzed from the waist down and in chronic pain. Noelia spent parts of her life in institutional care following a difficult childhood. In an interview on the Spanish Antena 3 program, Y Ahora Son Soles, she said, quote, I want to go now and stop suffering, period. None of my family is in favor of euthanasia, but what about all the pain I've suffered during all these years? I don't feel like doing anything, not going out, not eating. Sleeping is very difficult for me, and I have back and leg pain. I've told them how I want it to be. I want to die looking beautiful. I've always thought I want to die looking good. I'll wear my prettiest dress and put on makeup. It will be something simple, unquote, she said. Her father sought to block her euthanasia through the courts, arguing against her right to die. Quote, he hasn't respected my decision and he never will. Why does he want me alive? To keep me in a hospital, unquote. Her father, supported by conservative advocacy group Abogados Cristianos, parentheses, Christian lawyers, end parentheses, argued that his daughter's mental health was affecting her ability to make a free and informed decision. But the court ultimately decided that Noelia had the, quote, full capacity to decide, unquote, whether to end her life by assisted dying. In June 2021, Spain legalized euthanasia and assisted suicide for people with incurable or severely debilitating conditions who wish to end their lives. Spanish law states that applicants who are over 18 with, quote, chronic or invalidating suffering, unquote, can choose to receive assisted dying. Assisted dying is currently illegal in the UK under the Suicide Act 1961. Here ends the article. At the bottom of the article, we see a note saying, the impact of suicide reaches far and wide. Call Samaritans for free on 116-123. Email joe@samaritans.org or visit samaritans.org for more information. Ultimately, this article feels like an impassioned description, and I would not say endorsement, but very much empathizes with Noelia for the trauma that she experienced and for her decision, and notes how long the legal process took for her to be able to make that decision. If it wasn't for a judge saying, yes, You have the ability to make your own decisions, thereby invalidating her father's arguments. She wouldn't have been able to take the brave step she took to be able to end her own suffering. And it details the amount of suffering she went through, from state-supervised care to institutional care and gang rape, and the attempted suicide left her paralyzed. Such tragedy in such a young life. And it doesn't sound like the people who gang raped her were ever brought to justice. But enough about empathy and a description of the process. Let's move on to an evangelical article. Now, looking at the article from evangelicalfocus.com by Jennifer Diaz, posted March 26, 2026, the title reads, "Death as a Way Out, Noelia's Precedent in Spain." A young woman who experienced trauma and attempted suicide obtains judicial approval for her euthanasia request in 2024, despite her family's objections, setting a precedent for psychiatric suffering cases. I read, Noelia Castillo Ramos is a 25-year-old woman from Barcelona, Spain, who will end her life through euthanasia on 26 March after a long legal battle. Her controversial case has attracted widespread media attention in Spain. The last few years of Noelia's life have been marked by intense pain. She was diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder, at a young age, a serious condition that causes emotional instability, a profound sense of emptiness, and fantasies of self-harm. Going to the APA.org for the 9 criteria for diagnosing borderline personality disorder from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, I read, outlines 9 criteria for borderline personality disorder, with a diagnosis usually requiring someone to display 5 or more of these symptoms. 1. Frantic efforts to avoid abandonment, whether real or imagined. 2. Unstable and intense interpersonal relationships that alternate between extremes of idealization and devaluation. 3. Markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. 4. Impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging, such as spending, substance abuse, reckless driving, sex, or binge eating. 5. Recurring suicidal behavior, gestures, or threats or self-harming behavior. 6. Affective instability because of a marked reactivity of mood. 7. Chronic feelings of emptiness. 8. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. 9. Transient, stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. Note that for the purposes of this article, they only focus on the suicidal ideation. Continuing on, she has been under state guardianship since the age of 13. Due to their limited financial situation, her parents have had to rely on public resources for her care. In 2022, she was raped, the details of which remain largely unknown. This traumatic event was the breaking point in her life, after which she attempted suicide by jumping from a 5th-floor window. She survived but was left paraplegic. Since then, she has had to use a wheelchair and take different medications to relieve the pain. Although these medications are effective, they cause her severe side effects. Side note, note that they don't note how or what kind of side effects she's getting, how severe they are. They also don't link you to other outside articles as well. Continuing on. After conducting several mental capacity tests and treatments, the psychiatrist who treated Noelia concluded that, despite her BPD, she was capable of making decisions about her life and death. However, her story portrays profound pain, traumatic events, and a BPD diagnosis, which at least partially clouds the autonomy attributed to her by the doctors, since BPD can severely affect a person's emotions and undoubtedly impact decision-making. In 2023, a discharge report concluded that Noelia was medically stable and her physical pain was under control. Nevertheless, despite all her father's efforts to change her mind, on April 10, 2024, she officially requested euthanasia from the Catalan Commission for the Guarantee and Evaluation of Rights. Just a couple of months later, on July 18, 2024, the Commission accepted the request. Side note, note that they don't note any of the extending legal battles that caused the euthanasia to be pushed through to this current month, in March 2026. Note that they don't note specifically all of the legal battles that Noelia went through in order to have her right to end her life. Continuing on, Noelia gave a final television interview before her death, in which she reaffirmed her decision to end her life with the support of her mother, although the latter made it clear that she did not want this ending for her daughter either. The family is actually divided on the issue. Her father sought help from the Christian Lawyers Association, arguing that Noelia was not psychologically capable of making that decision. Against his wishes, the process continues. Side note. Note the contrast between the way the mother is presented and the father is presented. Definitely has this patriarchal Christian bias, which is very, very telling. Continuing on, this case sets a dangerous precedent in Spanish society, suggesting that a life of extreme suffering is no longer, quote, worthy, end quote, of being lived. Ours is a failed state that allows its citizens to resort to death not only for physical pain, but also for mental illness, as in Noelia's case. Side note, does the author mean that Noelia's case was the first for both physical pain and mental illness? Because then the author is also ignoring a huge compounding factor here. The brutal rape that Noelia suffered. Because then trauma would need to be talked about. And I don't think that in evangelical circles, regardless of where they're located, they consider trauma a mitigating factor. Unlike secular society, or what they would see as secular society. Continuing on, the 2021 organic law regulating euthanasia in Spain, linked here, was originally approved for people suffering from a chronic incurable illness that causes significant pain. This was based on the new individual right, namely the autonomy to exercise freedom over one's own life and death. Between June 2021 and mid-2025, euthanasia has been applied to 1,034 people in Spain. Side note, they mistyped here. They meant to say euthanasia has been chosen by at least 1,034 people in Spain. Continuing on, but as anticipated, there is currently no clear definition of what constitutes this type of painful illness. This case raises the question, do depression, various personality disorders, and borderline personality disorder fall under this category? The answer seems to be yes. Side note, again, they ignore the question of trauma. If you had a traumatic event that happened to you that caused your feelings, your suicidal feelings to come to place and for them to manifest and for you to attempt, and then for, unfortunately, your attempt to fail, as well as you to be bound to a wheelchair for the rest of your foreseeable life because your attempt failed. Again, trauma is serious, but apparently only secular society believes in trauma, as this article does not mention trauma as a mitigating factor. Continuing on, we look with concern to a future that already seems dystopian, because depression is currently spreading throughout the world like a pandemic, and Spain is one of the countries with the highest suicide rates among young people. Can the solution to this mental health crisis be entrusted to this state? Does society have the necessary tools to respond to profound suffering? Noelia's case suggests it does not. Side note, on the contrary, Noelia's case seems like it has all the safeguards that secular society has for making a decision as serious as deciding to end one's own life. She went through the process. She was diagnosed as capable of making her own decisions. And after multiple legal battles, she finally won the right to make her own decisions, regardless of what her father wanted. Continuing on, the state is making a serious mistake by believing that the dignity of life can be defined in terms of suffering. It would be wise to view with suspicion this law based on the right to personal autonomy, which ignores that life is not the absolute private property of the individual, but rather has an origin and purpose that transcend the person. God breathed a breath of life into Noelia, created her, and was pleased to see her born, so that she might know him and find the meaning of her life in him. Side note, and where does the rape that she suffered fit into that? Where does the paraplegic that she suffered after her suicide attempt failing, where does that fit in? Note that these questions do not get asked here, because then that would make their simplistic attempt to cover this a lot less easier to talk about. Continuing on, Noelia's pain is real, and her desire to end her suffering is legitimate and entirely understandable. However, even though she is broken inside and has lost the will to live, Noelia was made in the image of God. Her life has incalculable value. Side note, they miswrote that. They should have said, even though she was broken by the trauma she experienced by the rape and subsequent depression and suicidal ideation because of that, we think her life has incalculable value. There, combined both sentences. A lot simpler. Continuing on, this is a heartbreaking story that should move us deeply. We live in a time of a total loss of the value of human life, where people have become disposable consumer goods. Society was unable to restore hope to Noelia and then offered her the quick way out, disguised as, quote, dignified, end quote, death. That is quite the opposite of the message of the gospel, which delves into the heart of suffering to redeem it, not necessarily to eliminate it. God can redeem a life even in such extreme circumstances. Job longed for death. Elijah cried out to God to take his life. But undoubtedly, the most extreme case of physical and emotional pain was suffered by our Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus is an expert in impossible causes. He is the Lord of those who seek him, of the brokenhearted. He is the comforter and the giver of hope. The state surrendered too quickly with Noelia. God would never have done so, and neither should we surrender to the suffering of others by offering death as a solution. Here ends the article. Adding a couple extra thoughts. God interacted directly with Job and with Elijah. He did not interact directly with Noelia. Apparently, God was satisfied with leaving Noelia's decision up to her, and thought that the safeguards that the state had in place for making such a profound and impactful decision as that she made was enough. All right, we reviewed an empathetic, an impassioned article, and we also looked at an evangelical article. Now, circling back to Reddit, subreddit MorbidReality, posted by user Darkly Heritage, with the pink red tag that says not safe for work, we read a linked post with multiple links attached titled Gang Rape Victim Noelia Castillo Ramos, age 25, dies by euthanasia in Barcelona, Spain, after a prior suicide attempt jumping from a fifth-floor window left her paraplegic, and her father's 2-year legal challenge to prevent her euthanasia fails. Note here more details, and these details were all sourced from Sky News, Wikipedia, Spectator.com, The Times, and New York Times. We see that Noelia was a victim of gang rape, at least on 2 different occasions. The first by her ex-boyfriend, and the second time in a gang rape attack by 3 boys back from 2022. To Noelia, that second attack was a turning point. She had already been receiving psychiatric treatment since she was age 13 when her parents separated, and then diagnosed with OCD and BPD. She made multiple suicide attempts before the one that ultimately left her a paraplegic, and her father also witnessed that one. And it's interesting to note that because her father began that legal battle to try to prevent her from going to do euthanasia. Her request had been granted by a specialized expert committee in Catalonia in July 2024, but her father, Noelia Castillo, brought legal action, supported by Abogados Cristianos. He argued that her psychiatric history and mental illness impaired her ability to decide euthanasia was right. The legal battle took nearly 2 years and finally reached Spain's highest tribunal, which was the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court rejected his case, and then Geronimo went to the European Court of Human Rights. Then his request was rejected on March 10th, 2026. His last-minute attempt asking investigating court looking into her medical legal team also failed. It's important to note that it was her father driving this, not her mother. Her mother, although her mother disagreed with Noelia's decision, her mother ultimately supported whatever it is that Noelia wanted to do, believing in her daughter's ability to choose and to make the right choice for her own life. Her father did not. Ending on final words that we know of from the victim. And I say victim because she is a tragic victim of the gang rape, of the rape by the ex-boyfriend, of suicide attempts, and of the biology behind BPD and OCD, which all brought together a huge amount of suffering to her before she became a paraplegic. And to anyone who is evangelical who's listening to this, I ask you to make the world a safer place for women to report their rapes, to report their rapists, and to encourage and support those women coming forward. False rape accusations are less than 2%, and accurate, true rape convictions are far more than 5 times that percentage, which means we are failing women as a society, and we need to listen to them more. Make that kind of world available for women. Then we can talk about assisted suicide / euthanasia. Anyway, ending on Noelia's final words. Noelia said, quote, "I finally done it. Let's see if I can finally rest," end quote. Rest in peace, Noelia. You did not deserve the hell on earth that you were experiencing. Thank you for watching / listening, and I will see you in the next one.